Good afternoon. My name, as it says up here, is Alister Chapman. I'm a DP cinematographer from, you probably guessed by the accent, not from around here, from the UK. I'm also a Sony ICE. And in the next hour or so, I'm going to take you through Sony's cameras, the large sensor cameras from the A7s through to the F65. And I actually own most of these cameras and shoot with them. So I'm going to go through from the user's point of view. So first, a little bit of my background. Over 20 years working as a cinematographer in broadcast television, drama, commercials, features. I shoot a lot of stock footage for National Geographic, Discovery, BBC Natural History Unit, people like that. And I'm also a Sony ICE, that's an independent certified expert. So although I'm here today to talk to you on behalf of Sony, I don't work for Sony as such. And I do also run and write this website here, xdcamuser.com, and I write about the technology behind a lot of these cameras, articles on how to get the most out of them, how to shoot with them properly, and trying to demystify some of the stuff, so things like shooting with log correctly and things like that. And at the end of this presentation, I will be looking at just that. How do we shoot correctly with log and with raw with these cameras? So these are some of the things that I shoot. Hurricanes, tornadoes, northern lights, drama, documentaries, commercials. So big, wide range. Anyway, let's look at the cameras. And hopefully this slide will work for me. So A7s, starting at the bottom over on the right side. A7s Mark II and A7R Mark II. Nice compact cameras. Sony's PXW FS5, another nice, small, compact, easy to use camera. The FS7, F5 and F55, and the big daddy, the flagship camera, the F65. So we're going to look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. I've shot with all of them, and I currently actually own an A7s, an FS5, an FS7, and an F5, although I'm going to have to thin that down a bit soon because I don't really need them all. So, common features of all these cameras. They have all got a large sensor, whether that's super 35mm or, in the case of the A7s and A7R, a full-frame sensor. They all, with the exception of the F65, use Sony's XAVC codec, and I'll be talking about that codec later on. They all have S-Log2 and S-Log3, so they're really, really good at capturing a big, wide dynamic range. They also all have S-Gamut, S-Gamut 3, and S-Gamut 3 Cine. This is the color science, the color space of the camera. So because the cameras share the same log curves, the same dynamic range, and largely the same color science, they're really good when you want to mix and match. You might be shooting a feature film and you might want to use the F65 as your main camera and then mix that in with an F55. Or at the other end, you might be shooting some interviews with super shallow depth of field on the full frame sensor of the A7s, A7R, and then mixing that perhaps with some B-roll from an FS5. So lots of ways of mixing these cameras together. They can all shoot UHD or 4K or better because the F65 has an 8K sensor and a highly adaptable lens mount, and we can really sort of change our lenses and things like that. So just looking at lens mounts to start off with, because your pictures always start with the lens. The quality of your lens will determine the final quality of your image. You really want to have that best possible lens. So the A7s, A7R, FS5, and the FS7 all use Sony's E-mount, and there's a fabulous display of all the lenses that are available for E-mount at the back of the booth here, and it's a huge range. But the beauty of E-mount is that through some very cheap, very low-cost adapters, starting at around about $50, we can put just about any lens that we want on these cameras. And in fact, I've yet to find a lens that you can't put on an A7s or FS5, certainly a lens that you'd want to use. The F5 and F55 are a little bit different. They come from Sony with a PL mount on the camera, but that mount is removable. And once you've removed the PL mount, you can then replace it with, again, a huge range of adapters to use a vast range of lenses. I often use Canon lenses on my cameras. So we can use just about any lens that we want on these cameras. That picture up there's a little bit out of date. There's a lot more lenses now in the E-mount range. And one point to put across right now is that E-mount, one of its big benefits over, let's say, Canon or something like that, is the aperture works smoothly. Try and use a Canon lens on these cameras, you can do it, it's fine. but the aperture works in steps. Whereas the E-mount lens is nice, smooth aperture, so it's much better for video production if you want to change your exposure during the shot. FS5, which we'll see in a bit, there is a way of getting around that issue if you want to use Canon lenses. So let's look at the mirrorless cameras. This is the A7R Mark II. The R stands for resolution. It's a 42 megapixel camera, so really, really high resolution stills, but it also shoots very high quality 4K and HD video. Then we have its companion here, the A7s Mark II, and the S stands for sensitivity. So on this camera, we only have 12 megapixels. So the photographs, you take photographs with it, they're not so high resolution, but hands up here, who actually prints out their photographs these days? No hands up, one. Most of us now are looking at our photographs on tablets, on TVs and things like that. Even if you've got a 4K TV, the resolution of your photos exceeds that resolution of the screen. So, do we really need 42 megapixels? Anyway, the benefit from a video point of view of only having 12 megapixels is those pixels are big. So it makes the camera very, very sensitive. We have compact ergonomic design, amazing image quality, 14 stops of dynamic range, UHD recording, XAVC-S is the codec, very good codec to have in a small camera like this. 120 frames per second in HD, so we can shoot some really nice slow motion, full frame sensor for very shallow depth of field, and 5-axis image stabilization along with picture profiles and S-Log and all of those nice things. Now, the image stabilization is very clever. It's actually in the body of the camera. We actually move the sensor to stabilize with almost any lens. It's 5-axis, so roll and yaw and pitch and everything else. And you can actually combine that with an optically stabilized lens as well for really stable images without using a gimbal or anything like that. It's a really nice feature. But the A7s, its really big party trick is its low light performance. And I recommend that you go to the very back of the booth. There's a little a curtain there, and if you go in there into a little dark room, you'll be amazed at how sensitive this camera is. They've got a nice little setup there demonstrating the low light performance. And it's my go-to camera when I go up to Norway in the winter each year to shoot the Northern Lights or to shoot in the Arctic winter, where for almost 3 months of the year, the sun doesn't actually come up above the horizon. So you have nothing but low light. The nice thing is, actually, for a lot of those days, the sun is just below the horizon, so you actually have golden hour almost all day, which is fantastic. But you need a camera that can do really well in low light for the Northern Lights, things like that, and the A7s is a really, really sensitive camera. I can actually video in real time the Northern Lights. This is a frame grab from a video of the Northern Lights. So moving on, the PXW FS5. I call this a star in the making because I don't think people are really sort of realizing the full potential of this camera. And in fact, it's only really at NAB with some announcements that we've had here that we're really sort of starting to really squeeze every bit that we can out of this camera. I recommend that you go and look at it. You pick it up if you can, you hold it, because you will be amazed at how lightweight this camera. It's incredibly light. It's actually virtually no heavier than the DSLRs. But from a video standpoint, it's much better ergonomically. We have a nice, comfortable, easy to hold hand grip. We can actually control the lens. We can zoom in, zoom out. We can focus from that hand grip. So again, large sensor camera, super 35mm, 4K XAVC recording. Well, I'm going to be very specific here. It's UHD 4K, which is the standard for 4K television, 3840 by 2160. Sony's E-mount again, so we have that great lens flexibility, 14 stops of dynamic range thanks to S-Log 2 and S-Log 3, and 10-bit 422 HD recording. In UHD, XAVC-S is only 8-bit, so it's not quite so good in UHD, but as you'll see in a moment, there is a way around that. We have 240 frames per second in full HD slow motion, and the slow motion of this camera really is gorgeous. Low-cost media, SDXC cards, about $30 each, so you can afford actually to not have to back these up. Shoot on it, keep the card, buy another card for the next project. You get 2 hours of HD on a 64 gigabyte card and an hour of 4K of UHD on that same card. So it's really very cost effective. Run and gun friendly, and we now have the ability to record RAW with this camera, thanks to an update. Small and light, and one of the great things about this camera that I really love is a variable ND filter. So this is actually an ND filter. It's a real ND filter. It's not an electronic trick. There is actually a piece of very high-tech glass in there that gets darker as you apply a voltage to it. Doesn't polarize the light. There's no polarization issues and things like that. And that's one of the things that makes this camera really easy to use, because if I want to make an exposure change, I have so many choices now. I can change the aperture, I can change the shutter speed, or I can vary the ND. Now, if I'm using a Canon lens on this camera where the aperture goes in steps, not a problem. Use the ND filter instead. You can do some really interesting things. You can now do depth of field pulls mid-shot because you have auto ND as well. The aperture and the ND filter will work together, and you can change your ND during the shot. You won't see an exposure change, but your depth of field changes. How cool is that? Walking from inside to outside, following somebody. You walk outside with a traditional camera from the dark inside, you have to close down the aperture. The depth of field of the shot changes hugely, and the inside shot, big wide aperture, looks film-like. The outside shot, very small aperture, looks video-like because that depth of field changes. You don't get that filmic look. With this camera, use the ND filter instead. So inside, no ND or quarter ND, which is the minimum with the variable. And as you walk outside, you just open up the ND, the exposure, or close down the ND rather. The exposure remains constant. The depth of field remains constant. So the shot stays looking the same. It retains that film-like look as you do that. It's a really important function, and I want this in all my cameras now, not just in this one. I want it in everything. So what the PXW FS5 is not, though, and this is very important, is it's not really a digital cinema camera. If you want that, you want to go up to the FS7, the F5 and 55, which we'll look at in a minute. And the reason I say that is because it doesn't have lookup tables. There is a gamma correcting LUT for the viewfinder. It's a viewfinder only for when you're shooting in log, so it does restore the contrast in the viewfinder, but it's not really a lookup table as such. There's no Cine EI mode, so exposing your log is a little trickier perhaps with this camera than it is with some others. If you set your zebras at 70%, shoot in S-Log2 or S-Log3, and you expose white with the zebras at 70%, you will get very nice exposure. But you don't have the luxury of EI where you can offset your exposure more simply. It's only, I say only, Quad HD or UHD 3840 by 2160, but that's fantastic for television. If you're doing stuff to go on your 4K TV, that's what you want. But if you're doing stuff for the cinema, normally that's 4096 by 2160. So there are some restrictions and limitations for this with this camera. Only 8-bit as well in UHD, still very nice. So it's not really a digital cinema. It's not quite a shrunk down FS7. The battery life on this camera, the BPU 60 battery that goes in this camera will actually run the camera for well over 4 hours. Whereas on the FS7, the camera we'll look at next, it only runs it for about an hour and a half. Now, why is it different? Well, it's because the FS7 has a lot more processing power than this camera. This camera is built to be low power, so there's less processing power. And as a result, the picture from this camera isn't quite, it's very, very close, but it's not quite what you'll get from the FS7. So if you're really into high-end stuff, you might want to consider the FS7. FS5, what is the FS5 good at? The FS5 is a superb run and gun camera. That auto ND filter makes using it really, really simple, really, really easy. It's also the ergonomics of it, the way the hand grip is laid out. I can control on the hand grip my aperture, on the side of the camera my ND. I have automatic ND. I can actually change the ND automatically. So all of these things make the FS5 very good for run and gun. The zoom lens, power zoom, it comes with an 18 to 105 millimeter servo zoom lens if you want. So I can zoom in, I can zoom out, and I can do all of those nice things that make working with a camera like that really easy. So FS5, what can we do? The FS5 is really good now. One of the new things is that the latest firmware update gives you that auto ND, but we can now also take a RAW output from the camera. And by taking a RAW output, it's 12-bit, full data from the sensor. It doesn't have gamma curves and things like that applied to it. So it gives us a much better signal than we can otherwise get with the camera. It's also 4K, so you can actually do 4096 by 2160 with the camera. And that's a really great powerful tool to have. You have to use an external recorder, such as the Convergent Design Odyssey or the Atomos Shogun to do it. But it really does mean that you can dramatically improve the quality of the images that you get out of the FS5, and perhaps then does take it up to that more sort of capable digital cinematography area. But if you really want digital cinematography, this is the camera you want to be looking at, or the entry level for digital cinematography, the FS7. It's 4K. It's also Ultra HD and HD. It has multiple codecs. You have XDCAM, you have XAVC. You also have ProRes as an option. By adding an extension unit onto the back of the camera, you can record ProRes to the cards in the camera. And it has a custom mode and a Cine EI mode, and I'll explain a little bit about those modes in a minute. Other things that it can do. Now the FS5, when you do slow motion with that camera, it uses an internal memory buffer, because you can't write 240 frames per second of HD to SD cards at sensible image quality. So there's an internal memory buffer in the camera, and that does limit you at 240 frames per second HD to 8 seconds of super slow motion. So you shoot for 8 seconds, play it back, of course it's slowed down by 10 times, that's an 80-second long clip. Now in the FS7, we're using much faster media, we're using XQD cards, and as a result we can write continuously to those cards in slow motion. So we can do 180 frames per second continuously, or at least until your media is full. So if you want to do long events and things like that in slow motion, the FS7 is a much better choice. Again, we can shoot RAW with the FS7. If we add the RAW recorder, either Sony's IF-R5 and R5 or the Convergent Design or Atomos options, we can shoot at up to 240 frames per second in HD and in 2K. So long-op or iframe XAVC codecs. I'll come on to the codecs in a bit more detail in a minute. So we have a choice now of either long-op or iframe. The FS5 is long-op only. You have dual HD SDI outputs. And the beauty of that, especially when you're working with lookup tables and things like that, is you can have one that is a clean output, perhaps without lookup tables, and the other one can have your overlays, lookup tables applied, and things like that. So there's a lot more monitoring options with this camera. You also have 4K HDMI out as well. So lots and lots of options with the camera. Now, custom and Cine EI modes. This is where the FS7 gets much more interesting. Custom mode is what you see is what you get shooting. What you see in the viewfinder is what's recorded on the cards, and that's more or less what the client, your customer, or the viewer will see. That's your finished product. The Cine EI mode is designed specifically for shooting in S-Log2 or S-Log3. Now, something that's very important when you shoot with log, to get those 14 stops of dynamic range from the camera, you want the camera to operate at its native ISO. And in the Cine EI mode, the camera is locked to the native ISO, so you're less likely to make a mistake. And then using something called exposure index, you can offset your exposure lower or higher depending on the type of scene that you're shooting. Generally, with a log camera or a raw camera, you want to expose nice and bright. So the FS7's native ISO is 2000 ISO, so that's the recording sensitivity. But with the EI mode, I'll typically set my FS7 to 1000 EI. That makes the picture in the viewfinder darker. And as a cameraman, when I see a dark picture in my viewfinder, I tend to open the aperture to compensate. So the recording, which is actually happening at the native 2000 ISO, ends up a bit brighter. So my noise becomes less significant, and it all comes out nicely. And we'll look at this a little bit more as we go along. So we can shoot in the Cine EI mode, offset my exposure to get the very best out of the camera, shoot in log or raw. You grade that then in post-production, and your final look is created in post. It's a two-step workflow as opposed to a more conventional one-step workflow. So the XAVC codec, let's just have a little look at that, because all these cameras have different versions of XAVC in them. So it's flexible. It's a codec designed for the future, and it goes everything from a proxy all the way through to 4096 by 2160 4K. The FS5, a nice thing the FS5 can do, is we can record in UHD, and alongside the UHD actually record a proxy. And that's very useful because on the FS5, the codec, the XAVC version is XAVC-L, the long-op version. And anybody that works with long-op codecs will know that they require a bit more processing power to deal with. So in the FS5, you need a really good computer to edit your footage, but you also have proxy files. So you can do your editing and the stuff where you need a very fluid workflow with the proxies that are created in the camera. And then at the end of your workflow, when you come to grade your footage, swap the proxies out for the full res files. FS5 can do that. FS7 has iframe and long-op, so you can make a choice. You can choose which codec you want depending on the picture quality that you need. Not a huge difference in image quality unless you're in in 4K, in which case XAVC-I is always 10-bit 422. 24 frames per second. XAVC-L is only 100 megabits per second. It's barely more than what we've been using for HD currently. It's a very efficient codec. In 4K, 24 frames per second, XAVC-I is roughly double that, a little more than double. It's about 220 megabits per second. So you still get a reasonable amount of content on your cards. So a 64 gigabyte XQD card in the FS7 running in 4K, you'll still get 30 minutes, just over 30 minutes on a card. It's very efficient. Compare that to ProRes. ProRes was designed as an editing codec. It was designed for use in post-production, where people have RAID arrays and big fat hard drives. So it doesn't really matter if the bit rate is a bit higher. ProRes HQ is 880 megabits per second. It's nearly 4 times bigger. And that makes a big difference. If you were shooting in ProRes in 4K, your 64 gigabyte XQD card's only going to last you 10 minutes. And you'd have to have a lot of media. So XAVC makes a lot of sense as a shooting format for shooting with, and that's what it's designed for. I've compared the two side by side, ProRes and XAVC, and even if you go down several generations, it's really difficult to tell any difference between them. So FS7, built-in LUTs. This really helps when you're shooting with log. It means you don't have to look at that flat, washed-out picture. You can apply the LUT, and you can apply custom LUTs. You can create your own LUTs and looks so you can preview what your production will look like or give an idea of what it will look like after it's been graded. And that can all be done in the camera. And this is what really makes the FS7 different from the FS5. FS7 also does RAW, again with the Odyssey 7Q or with the Atomos Shogun. 12-bit linear RAW, no gamma, no other degradation, but you do have to do a lot of processing in post-production. Now, something actually before I go on that I'll point out here is that the RAW, Sony's RAW, is compressed. It's 3:1 compressed. The 12-bit RAW that we get if we shoot at 24 frames per second with an FS7, the bit rate is actually around about 960 megabits per second. Now, who can remember what ProRes was in 4K? 880 megabits per second. So we're actually got the benefits of RAW and all of the linear benefits. So linear has a lot more picture information in the highlights, much less image degradation. There's no gamma curve steals and things like that, for virtually no extra overhead in terms of bit rate, file size, and things like that, compared to ProRes. Now that's if you use Sony's IFR5 and R5 recorder, where the RAW is compressed 3:1. If you're using the convergent design or the Atomos recorders, the compression isn't there. RAW is quite inherently efficient. Now, if you really, really want to get into RAW workflows, then I really recommend that you step up to these cameras, the PMW F5 and the PMW F65, because these cameras are designed from the outset to work with RAW. The RAW recorder docks directly onto the back of the camera. The camera at the top there has the recorder docked onto the back. No, it doesn't actually. But the RAW recorder does dock directly onto the back of the camera. You have amazing quality because now the RAW is 16-bit instead of 12-bit. So a lot more picture information. Again, like the FS7, multiple codec choices. We have all the options in the FS7 plus SSTP, which is the same as HD Cam SR. Slow motion to 240 frames per second. Time lapse, you have the ENG shoulder kit, which is the top camera, built up for ENG productions, but with shallow depth of field, film-like looks. Low power consumption. For a camera of this type, with this much processing power, it's still very light on batteries. It's about 24 watts fully configured. If you compare that to a lot of other digital cinema cameras, it's about a quarter of the power consumption. So very, very good on batteries. It's modular constructed inside. So if you actually own a BMW F5 and you decide, well, actually, I want the features of the F55, that can be done. They can actually change out the sensor, update the camera, and turn it into a 55. It's all a modular design. So if you want ProRes, it's a new module that goes in, and that gives you ProRes internal recording. And we've just released, or Sony have just released, a new RAW recorder for these cameras, the R7. And I'll talk about that in a minute. We also have version 7 firmware, which is new, with a quick menu. Makes the cameras really easy to use and really simple to use. So this is the quick menu. You press the option button on the side of the camera now, and instead of having to go into the menu to change all your project settings, frame rates and things like that, we can do it directly on the side of the camera using the hotkeys around the side display. And this is one of the things that separates the F5 from the FS7. So the FS7, in terms of recording quality, image quality, things like that, is virtually the same as the F5. But it doesn't have this side panel display. And this is one of the things that makes the F5 very fast, very easy to use. And I wouldn't underestimate the value of this. It's really, for me, and I own both an FS7 and F5, the thing that really differentiates these cameras, makes it much, much easier to use the F5 and the F55. So again, 14 stops of dynamic range, very low noise, very accurate color. The F55 camera has frame image scan, so that's more commonly known as a global shutter, so there are no CMOS artifacts. So if you're doing any compositing where it's really important that the verticals in your picture stay vertical, that's a really big thing to have and very important. The F55 shares the same color filter technology as Sony's F65. And that means that you get not only better color reproduction, but a wider color range. And that's really important when we start looking forwards and going into HDR, because high dynamic range productions aren't just about color, aren't just about contrast, they're about color. So the new R5 RAW recorder really allows us to take our RAW recording to the next level. RAW can be log or it can be linear. Some manufacturers choose to use log. The issue with log is that in the real world, every time you go up a stop in brightness, the amount of light doubles. So if I want to light a scene one stop brighter than previously, I have to double the amount of light. When you use linear RAW, the recorder actually allocates twice as much data to each stop as you go brighter. So you're accurately capturing the world the way it really is. You're not sacrificing anything at all in your highlights. Log recording uses the same amount of data for every stop above your midpoint. So as you're going up and up and up in your very, very bright highlights, you're not gaining any extra data. Each extra brighter stop has the same amount of data. So if you hugely overexpose log, you will end up with a slightly flat-looking overexposed highlights. So linear preserves everything, and that's what Sony use, linear RAW. The F55, F5, they're all 16-bit linear, so F65 as well, and that gives you the correct amount of data for 14 stops. 12-bit with 14 stops is really pushing that technology. You can do it, it works, but you've got to get your exposure just right. You really have to be very careful. With 16-bit, you have a little bit more flexibility. Sony's, we've talked about the compressed already, but RAW, fairly efficient anyway, because you're not encoding the signal into RGB, you're just taking that raw Bayer data, processing it on your computer in post-production. So, one thing that the new R5 RAW recorder brings is the ability to shoot 4K RAW at 120 frames per second. There's no pixel binning, there's no line skipping, there's nothing needed to be done. We just take that raw sensor data, 120 frames per second. Add to that the ability to record using a memory cache of up to 30 seconds. And we suddenly have a combination that's actually going to be really, really good for anyone doing wildlife. So you can get that beautiful slow motion of the animals, 120 frames per second, but you also have 30 seconds or up to 30 seconds of cache record for unexpected events. And I'm really looking forward this summer to taking an F55 with the R7 out to shoot the thunderstorms and the lightning that I shoot, because I'll just be able to point the camera at the storm, wait for the lightning to strike, and then press record. So I can get my lawn chair out and a few beers and everything else, point the camera at the storm and just sit there, flash of lightning, record. Yeah, got it, easy. So it's going to be really good. Dual card slots now as well. So you can shoot for a couple of hours with a pair of AXS cards in here, in RAW. Don't need to worry about card switching and things like that. It's all very nice. Splash-proof design, dust-proof as well, so much better environmentally sealed than the previous R5 RAW recorder. So really is a nice step up. Now just looking at this F65 sensor in a bit more detail, new standards are coming, Rec 2020 and HDR. The F55 camera is one of the few cameras out there that actually exceeds Rec 2020. It covers the full 2020 range, so it's a really good camera for the future, for HDR, and HDR is very much something that everybody is talking about right now. You walk around this show and HDR is everywhere. This display here, this is an HDR screen. If you've seen the videos that Sony have been showing, it's really impressive. And it's something that is going to become very important in all of our futures, is HDR. And HDR is not just about contrast, it's also about color. But if you really want the ultimate in images, well then we have Sony's F65. And the big thing about this camera is its sensor. Its sensor is truly unique. It's an 8K sensor, and it has 4K of green pixels. So most Bayer cameras with a Bayer sensor, they don't deliver the resolution that the sensor is. So a 4K sensor doesn't truly deliver 4K resolution. But the F65 sensor does. It's again designed for RAW. It can shoot 4K at up to 120 frames per second. It has a mechanical shutter as well. So it's a CMOS sensor with a mechanical shutter. The way the camera behaves is much more like a film camera. Yes, it is quite a big camera, it's quite bulky, it is quite heavy, but that gives Sony lots and lots of space for some really top-notch, high-quality image processing. So even when you shoot RAW, the way the signal that comes off that sensor, it's actually an analog signal, is converted with analog to digital converters and things like that. The way that processing is done is very, very important. And it's why there is a difference in the image quality between a camera like the FS5, the F5, the F55 and this camera. They all have better and better and better image processing. So because this has an 8K sensor, if we want to, in post-production, we can actually de-Bayer to 4K or 6K or 8K. Lots of options depending on what we need, depending on what we want. Really good camera for anamorphic. Even though it's a 16:9 sensor, because it's an 8K sensor, the anamorphic images you can get off this camera are really spectacular. Very, very good indeed. We have that unrivaled color gamut. Again, we have these better quality color filters. We have multiple LUT options on this camera now. So you're not just tied to one LUT. We can have one LUT in the viewfinder, a different LUT on the SDI outputs. We can mix and match. This camera has changed hugely since launch. There is a surplus of processing power in it, and Sony are now only just starting to really get the most out of the camera. In recently there's been new options added, like live Wi-Fi video streaming to a tablet, so you can monitor remotely, you can control the camera remotely, and do all the things that just weren't in this camera when it first came out. And it's also surprisingly affordable. I was quite surprised looking at the recent pricing, because this is it's sub $50,000 now. So it's really quite competitively priced. So all of these cameras, the common thing that they share is the ability to record with S-Log2 and S-Log3, the ability to capture 14 stops of dynamic range. The PMW F55 and 65 can capture and record an extended color range, wide color gamut. So all of these cameras are capable of doing HDR, high dynamic range, and the 55 and 65 can also do high color range to get the very best out of it. But when you start shooting in log, you have to start to think a little bit differently about how you expose and how you do things. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that there isn't an infinite amount of light in the real world. Thank goodness, because you'd step outside and we'd all be blinded by that infinite light level. There is only so much light in the real world. On a bright sunny day, you might have, on an outside scene, a 16 stop range. On an overcast dull range, you might only have 12, 13 stops of dynamic range. With a 14 stop camera, the range of that camera, the ability to capture that is so close to what we see with our own eyes that forgetting things like highlight roll-offs in the camera, the sensor itself is able to see the real world light roll-off. Because in the real world, highlights tail off. They don't clip, they roll off. So these cameras can actually capture that fall off, that roll off of light. This shot here shooting straight into the sun, bright sun coming off the light. Yes, the camera's clipping. Yes, it's overloading, but it's actually still rolling off into that overload. It's not a hard, nasty clip. And when we shoot with log, we have the same amount of picture information in each stop above middle gray. So this chart, let me explain this chart to you, this diagram. In the middle here, this is middle gray. This is our exposure reference that we use so often in photography and film. It's generally considered to be the midpoint in a scene. So if you were to take a scene and average out all the different light levels in that scene, you'd have middle gray. Or you can use a card, a gray card that reflects 18% of the light falling on it, and that is also middle gray. So this is middle gray. Anything this side is my shadows. That's darker stuff. Anything this side is my mid-range and my highlights. Now who here, and this isn't a test, who here is a, and let's be honest, well, it's NAB, so there should be a few of you, who here is a video cameraman? Quite a lot of you. Who here has heard the term, protect your highlights? Who here has heard the term, don't overexpose whatever you do? Yeah, that's video cameras. These cameras, you have to think differently. Now, why do we have to protect our highlights with video cameras? Who's heard of the knee or highlight roll-off or terms like that? Yes, you've heard of those terms. Traditional video cameras are trying to squeeze a signal into a very small range. So they use something called a highlight roll-off, a knee, or something like that to compress the highlights. There is no data in those highlights. So if you overexpose, it looks like rubbish because there's no picture information up there. Now, log gamma. This is completely different. You have to take your video cameraman head off and put your film cameraman head on, because every stop above middle gray is recorded with the same amount of picture information. There is no highlight roll-off. It does clip eventually when you reach the limit of the sensor, but there's no roll-off. Where is there a roll-off though? If we look at this chart, where is the roll-off? Well, it's down here in the shadows. So with a traditional video camera, we protect our highlights because there's a roll-off in the highlights. Where's the roll-off with this camera? It's in the shadows. So what do we need to protect? The shadows. We have to think completely differently when we shoot with log, and the same with RAW actually, is we no longer want to protect the highlights. We've got tons of picture information up there in the highlights. What we need to protect is the shadows. Because if you underexpose, it will be noisy, it will be grainy, because you're rolling off into the shadows. But your highlights have a ton of picture information. So let's have a look at some real examples. Oh, I've got my slide slightly wrong. So when we grade this footage, we want as little noise as possible, because noise is going to limit how much you can grade. You try and lift the picture, it gets grainy. But if you push your picture down, it gets cleaner. So we want to record brightly, so we have as little noise as possible when we go into post-production, so we can grade it. And trust me, if I say to you, right, go out and shoot with these cameras, overexpose it, just overexpose it a bit, forget your highlights. They will be fine. That's what you have to do. We have to really think that way when we're shooting with log. Forget about your highlights, get the mid-range right, and everything else will fall into place, I promise you. So let's have a look at some real-world examples. So this is Cine Gamma 3. This is conventional shooting with an FS5. Camera's got a huge amount of dynamic range. It's still actually got about 10.5 stops, even when I'm shooting like this. So we've got good dynamic range. But we're overexposed. There's no picture information down here at all. It's all dark. There's nothing down here. Look at the branch of the tree. We can't see anything. And the highlights are overexposed. Now, in this scenario, traditional video methodology, you would protect the highlights because this overexposure looks horrible, and no matter what I do to it in post-production, it's never going to improve. So I need to shoot to protect my highlights, and that's how you would shoot conventionally normal camera. But this isn't a normal camera. This camera also has S-Log. Now this is the ungraded S-Log, and it's deliberately overexposed. Now I have to use the term overexposure very carefully. So Sony give us a load of numbers as to optimum exposure. For S-Log 2, middle grey, 32%, and white, 59%, it's either 59 or 61, let's say 60%. That would be the recommended exposure. That would put white at 60%. So in fact, this is much overexposed because white in this would actually be at around about 70%, and then my highlights are up here. Now, when you first look at this image, and if you're looking in the viewfinder of the camera, you'd look at it and you think, well, actually, it's not that different in the highlights to the Cinegammas. Look, it still looks overexposed in the highlights. It still looks blown out. It's still no good. But look at what's going on down in the shadows now. Because I'm overexposed, because I'm actually about 1.5 stops brighter than the recommended levels, so instead of exposing white at 60, I've exposed white at 70, I have lots of information in my shadows because I've opened my aperture up by an extra 1.5 stops. Loads of picture information here. We can see the picture information on the tree branch. But I can see somebody thinking, yeah, but your highlights are blown out. No, they're not. This is one of the things. There is real-world roll-off of these highlights. When we grade this, there is actually a ton of picture information up here in this highlight that wouldn't be there with a normal gamma curve. So we grade it, and we now start to see the real-world roll-off into this highlight. Does this look wrong to anybody, these highlights? No, they look normal. They are bright bits of stonework. If we look at the mortar in between the bricks up in, let me go back to the original slide. You look up here and you think, oh my goodness, that's overexposed. Well, it isn't, because there is a ton of picture information in those bright stops. It's there. Yes, it is just about clipping, but there is still data, even in that brightest stop. And this is the difference between standard gamma and log gamma. Standard gamma, that brightest stop has no data in it because there's a knee, there's a highlight roll-off, there's some highlight compression going on. Log gamma, there is no highlight compression. So even in that brightest stop that is right on the edge of being completely overexposed, there's still a ton of data there, and when you grade it, it comes back. So get your mid-range right, expose your mid-range nice and bright, and 99.99% of the time, the highlights will just fall into place and it will look great. Now, something else that happens when you overexpose brightly. Now, think about it. When you go out at night in the dark, forget the strip here, this is not a fair example. If you go into the woods, into a forest at night, can you see the color of the leaves on the trees? No. And a video camera is no different. If you underexpose a video camera, the sensor isn't getting much light on it. It doesn't see color very well. Expose it a bit brighter, put more light onto the sensor, it sees color better. So when you shoot with log, deliberately exposing a stop 1.5 stops brighter than the levels recommended by Sony, which I just consider to be minimums, you will get better color as well. I've seen many examples of people taking footage of cars, in particular, doing product shots for a commercial of cars, and dark colored car, they expose it dark. You take it into post, you try and grade it, it's really noisy and the color isn't there. But if they'd exposed it really brightly, the color would be there, it wouldn't be noisy, it would have a lovely sheen over it, it would look so much nicer. And it's a mistake people make because most of us video cameramen for our entire careers have been told to avoid shooting like this. It's what we're taught. We have to put that behind us, move on. These are film-like cameras. Expose it like that with log, which isn't hugely different from that. And the end result is a nice, well-exposed picture. Lots of picture information down in the shadows. Skin tones look much better, much cleaner, much less noise. So that's the way you have to work with these cameras. especially if you're going to do stuff for HDR, because HDR isn't just about brighter pictures, it's about range, dynamic range. So it's dark to light. For HDR to look really good, you want clean blacks. You want that black to be just solid black. You don't want it to be some milky, shadowy, grainy, noisy black. You want it to be a really good black. And how do you get the really good blacks? Expose brighter. Because then when it goes into post-production, you can pull it down, and when you pull it down, your noise disappears, goes away. It's how you get the best images. If you want to shoot HDR, well, you're going to need some sort of decent monitor. So we have Sony's BVMX300, really superb monitor, really fantastic. And the beauty of this is it can display 709, S-Gamut 3, P3, S-Log2, S-Log3, all of these things directly. And of course, I still struggle with this whole concept of feeding S-Log3, which normally looks flat on a 709 monitor, into a monitor like this, and it just looks right. Because when the gamma curve in the camera matches the gamma curve in the monitor, of course, the picture just looks correct. This is a really exciting time to be a cameraman, because finally, thanks to monitors like this, we can actually see what we're shooting. This is the first time in my career with a video camera I've actually been able to look at the monitor and actually see what I'm shooting with HDR. We've been so restricted and limited by display technology up till now. You know, cameras like the F3, which I had before the F565, could do 13 stops. Could never see it, but now, thanks to HDR, we can finally see what these cameras are doing, and they really create some beautiful images. And when you have those beautiful images, you need somewhere to store it. And I really do recommend this. I have this system myself, Sony's optical disc. It's robust, it's reliable. I used to use Sony's XD Cam optical disc cameras, and I put these discs from the optical disc cameras in the dishwasher to test them. Recorded some footage on a disc, put it in the dishwasher, washed the discs, took it out, dried it, played it back. You can store this stuff in a swimming pool and it'll still be okay. I recommend that you don't try that with LTO tape. You might not have quite such a satisfactory result. It's very robust, it's reliable. It's also random access, which is great for video. With LTO, if you want to find a clip from the middle of the tape, you have to shuttle through the tape. That wears the tape out. With this, the read head can go directly to the point on the disc or where your footage is and read it almost immediately. The head doesn't touch the disc, it doesn't wear, so it's very robust, it's much, much faster. And although it's primarily an archive medium, I'm actually using it for a lot of my sort of near-term storage. Yeah, I might be working on a project for a client, and that client might not be coming back in for another month, and instead of tying up some big hard drives or something like that, I'll just stick it on one of these optical discs. They're no more expensive than hard drives, but it's much more robust, much more reliable, really good system. And we have version 2 now, which is being expanded. So I just have the basic ODS 77U drive here, but I know that if some miracle happened and I became a full-fledged broadcaster, I could scale it all the way up to a media server and things like that with very little aggravation. Really nice software that comes with it, so everything's catalogued. You get thumbnails that sit on your computer. So you can offline search your entire archive, and then it just tells you, well, it's on this disk pack. You put the disk pack in, and you bring up your full resolution files very quickly, very easily. Really great system. So I have a few minutes left to take some questions if anybody has any questions. If not, we'll move on. And after me, there's a presentation from Jody Eldred on HDR and things like that. So do stick around for that. But yes, questions. So the question is, on optical disc, can you record any kind of data file? Absolutely, yes. It's just a storage medium, so you can record anything you want on there. You could put your family photos on there, your Word documents, your accounts. No, we should lose them. We'll lose the accounts perhaps. But you can put anything you want. It's just a file storage medium. But what is nice about it is it does come with the software for video, so that it does give you thumbnails and proxies and all that cataloging that's really sort of tailored for video. But you can put anything you want on there, just as reliably, just as safely. So it's a really good system. Any more questions? Do enjoy the rest of the show. I'm going to step off now, but in about just over 5 minutes, Jody Eldred will be doing another presentation that's really quite fascinating on HDR And this is an HDR display, so you'll get to see some really nice images. So thank you for listening.